court has heard that a Palestine Action activist struck a police officer with a sledgehammer.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this special insider briefing hosted by HR Canada Charitable Organization. Since October 7th, conversations about Israel, Gaza, and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict have become some of the most polarized and emotionally charged discussions in our public life. Yet, at the same time, many of these conversations have generated more heat than light, often becoming detached from the experiences, perspectives, and aspirations of the people most directly affected by the conflict itself. At HR Canada Charitable Organization, our mission is to advance education and foster greater understanding around antisemitism, discrimination, and social intolerance. We believe that meaningful dialogue requires more than slogans, sound bites, or ideological certainty. It requires a willingness to engage with complexity, to listen to diverse perspectives, and to learn from individuals whose lived experiences can help us better understand both the realities and the narratives that shape public perception. Tonight's discussion offers exactly that opportunity. We are honored to welcome Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, a Palestinian-American writer, analyst, and peace advocate who was raised in Gaza and has become one of the most prominent Palestinian voices advocating for coexistence, reform, and a pragmatic path forward for both Palestinians and Israelis. Drawing on his personal experiences, as well as his extensive work in public education and advocacy, Ahmed has challenged simplistic narratives about the conflict and has consistently called for a future grounded in dignity, accountability, and mutual recognition. We are equally privileged to be joined tonight by our moderator, Raheel Raza. Raheel is an award-winning author, journalist, public speaker, and one of Canada's leading advocates for human rights, religious pluralism, and interfaith understanding. Throughout her career, she has worked to build bridges between communities, challenge extremism in all its forms, and promote constructive dialogue on some of the most difficult issues facing our society. Together, Ahmed and Raheel will explore how activism, media narratives, and public discourse shape understanding of the conflict, influence attitudes towards Jewish communities, and affect perceptions of peace, coexistence, and human rights. They will also examine an important question: what happens when advocacy movements become disconnected from the people that they claim to represent? And what are the consequences for public understanding, social cohesion, and prospects for peace? Our goal this evening is not to tell people what to think, but to encourage deeper understanding, thoughtful reflection, and a more informed conversation, one that is grounded in evidence, lived experience, and a genuine commitment to peace and coexistence. Thank you again for joining us, and now it is my pleasure to turn things over to our host, Raheel Raza.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and privilege to be speaking with you, Ahmed, because you have a very unusual, amazing, and interesting journey that you've been on. Now, as a Gaza-born peace activist, writer, analyst whose perspective has become increasingly important and urgent in conversations surrounding Israel, Gaza, and Islamist radicalism, you bring a perspective that very few people have. So let me begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how those experiences shape the way you think about the Middle East conflict today.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me. I'm delighted to be here. And so, both elements of my lived experience are unusual, but what I would say is that they very much so are anchors in who I am today. I got to let's start with a little bit of more contemporary elements. I left the Gaza Strip in 2005, on July 1st, 2005. So that was 1 month before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements. It was called the disengagement. And it was a time of immense uncertainty, but also a time of immense opportunity. This was a time when then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon pulled Israeli settlements out of Gaza in a unilateral fashion. And some people think that that didn't help. Some people think that that was a test case, etc. But I maintain that that was really a missed opportunity for our people. Nevertheless, I left, and I'll never forget the last people I saw in Gaza as I was leaving. I was a 15-year-old coming to the United States as an exchange student in high school. It was a post 9/11 program created by the U.S. State Department to build cultural bridges between the Arab and Muslim world and the United States. The theory was that you come to the U.S., you live with a host family, you attend an American high school, you develop friendships, and this is also before the age and days of social media. And so these lasting human to human connections, you would subsequently take them back to your respective homeland and hopefully build cultural bridges that can narrow the gap between how people perceived the United States as a people versus the reality, and how people can see the separation between the US people, the US government, and develop that ability to have nuance and complexity. And so I came here, I finished the year in the San Francisco Bay Area. I lived in California with a host mother. And during my time in the US, I actually saw the degradation of the prospects for Gaza. Hamas won the infamous 2006 elections. My family all remained in Gaza. I have two brothers, two sisters. My dad, who passed away 6 years ago, he was a physician. He worked for UNRWA, the not so controversial UN agency in Gaza. I grew up in the UNRWA system, and my mom was a math teacher, and I'm the almost the youngest in my family, and I'm the black sheep. I'm the only one who's not in the medical field right now, the only one who's not married, the only one who doesn't have kids. But so I tried to go back to Gaza in June of 2006, and I was stuck in Egypt because, unfortunately, right as I was about to cross back into Gaza, Hamas abducted an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, and that was simultaneous with the 2006, almost simultaneous with the 2006 Lebanon war. And so I was stuck in Egypt for 3 months with no prospects. Thankfully, human rights and peace activists in the United States, including some Jewish allies and friends, including a Holocaust survivor, were able to cobble up contacts, resources, and bring me back to the US, where I began pursuing political asylum. Gaza was descending into chaos. Hamas was rising. There was a slow brewing civil war with Fatah, between the Palestinian Authority-led Fatah and then the Hamas itself with support from Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Iran. And then the very day of my political asylum journey, my political asylum interview was June 14th, 2007, which is the very day that Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. So I actually ended up being the first Palestinian from Gaza um, uh, 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 to receive asylum in the United States, because again, that was my interview took place on the very day that they took over. And I ultimately became a citizen, but to step back a little bit, Gaza was a complicated place. I grew up, my grandparents were 48 Palestinians who lost their homes in 48 when the state of Israel was created. And so that was a big component. The reference is to the Nakba. So that was kind of a big component of our narrative, of our literature, of our heritage. My parents grew up in horrible, horrendous refugee camps in the early 50s in southern Gaza, when Gaza was desolate, when Gaza was really kind of an empty wasteland, if you will. And then fast forward to Gaza was being administered by the Israeli military because Gaza was taken over in 1967 during the Six-Day War. Gaza was taken over from Egypt, which was administering Gaza, and the West Bank was taken over from Jordan, which was essentially had annexed the West Bank. And so then came the time of the Oslo, and I'm just offering a super bridge for time's sake. Then came the time of Oslo. And my dad, before Oslo, he had started working in Saudi Arabia as a doctor. This is a very common story for a lot of Palestinians. They work abroad in the Gulf, make money, and then go back to Gaza and build a home for their families and so on. So my family and I, right when the PA, Palestinian Authority, first came back, we started going back and forth to experiment. Can we move forward and can we move permanently back? And then we try to move permanently for like 2 years, and then we went back to Saudi, and then finally we moved back to Gaza in the year 2000 right before the second intifada. So I experienced the hope and optimism of peace associated with Oslo. We went from the Egyptian travel documents to the Palestinian Authority passport. Gaza had a short-lived airport. I flew into Gaza in 1999, and in the year 2000, um, I remember the new state institutions, getting our first cell phone. That was this massive device, our first landline, our first everything. So there was hope that this peace process was going to yield something really meaningful and beneficial. But this was also in the 90s when Hamas was doing its suicide bombings. It was attempting to derail the peace process because they did not believe in the two-state solution. So Gaza is a complicated place because I experienced the hope and optimism. There's beauty to the place, the beach, the food, the simplicity at the time of life. But I also experienced the violence associated with the Second Intifada, and I almost lost my life multiple times. But one case in particular left me with a lasting scar. I'm largely deaf in my left ear from an Israeli bombardment in 2001 that almost killed me and killed two of my friends, and rendered me asymmetrically hearing impaired. And so that's the thing about Gaza that defies the simplistic narratives is the amount of threads that make up the place, its people, its history. And that's ultimately what contributed, that's the foundation upon which I became who I am today.
Ahmed, you have such fascinating stories. I'm sure if we talk for half a day, it would still not be enough to cover everything. But we will try and do much of this. And I totally relate to the fact that you're the youngest and that you are considered the black sheep of the family. I'm in the same boat. So we are
Mashallah.
kindred
I love it.
souls.
I love it.
But you have become one of the most prominent critics of Hamas, prominent Palestinian critics of Hamas, while remaining deeply committed to the Palestinian cause. And I hear it from you. I hear, your love for the land despite the politics. So what led you to conclude that Hamas is not the answer for Palestinians? And how do you respond to those who see criticism of Hamas as disloyalty?
Certainly. So I grew up I come from a very devout Muslim family, and devout as in committed to the faith, not crazy, radical, committed to Hamas, etc. But so in that environment, I was involved in a lot of the local in Gaza, in particular, our mosque, for example. Very, very involved in there, and I memorized many chapters of the Quran. I was a very good student academically. I was, and I was actually one of Gaza's top English speakers from an early age. Um, I remember vividly the slow, and I didn't fully register it as a child, but I had early on, I've always been an old soul in a young body. And I remember going to a summer camp, but it turns out that this summer camp was actually dominated by Hamas guys. And I remember, I'll never forget this. It was a week-long camp. And even as an 11-year-old, I was so grossed out by the cheap propaganda. I went home and I laughed hysterically to my mom. I said, "These people are a joke." And I didn't go to the rest of the, not because I was like super anti-Hamas or super pro-Israel, but from an early age, I saw how Hamas didn't just create a political infrastructure, they were mass manipulating the religious and societal infrastructure of Gaza. Hamas changed the lexicon, the language, to where you didn't refer to them as Hamas, you refer to them as muqawama, the resistance. It's the word for resistance. So and the word salam, peace, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, every time you greet a fellow Muslim, you say peace be upon you in the Quran and prayers, etc. Hamas made the word salam synonymous with cowardly, betrayal, with being treacherous, with weakness. But muqawama was something aspirational. It was, and again, thousands and thousands of little examples like that. I saw how they really, really went after the Palestinian Authority, which was corrupt, was a problem, was this, was that. But we had an airport, and then Hamas, essentially through its own actions, led to a cascade of events that ultimately got, even though Israel destroyed the airport, there is a direct connection to what Hamas did. I saw how Hamas, the rightward shift in Israeli society, was very much so connected and tied to the rise of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and some of the other players. In other words, even though there's a power imbalance between Israel and the Palestinians, there was for forever, really, I always registered that there is plenty of space for Palestinian agency, responsibility, and accountability to understand why things have gotten really bad for our people. Yes, we can criticize Israeli actions and the Israeli government, and we can talk to the moon and back about Netanyahu and Sharon and the failures and the injustices and this and that. However, there very much so was a big component of our people that were motivated by Islamist nihilism, jihadi suicidalism, a sense of, I remember this book that became super famous. It was called Armageddon. They were basically like pushing for like the end of time prophecies that we need chaos in order for that. So that's one example. Fast forward to contemporarily, the squandering of the 2005 withdrawal opportunity to build Gaza into a role model of successful Palestinian self-governance, into showing that this is into Gaza becoming a model for what a military occupation free West Bank can look like. The amount of aid over the last 20 years, Gaza has received more aid, development, and support per capita than any other place in the world, any other conflict in the world. I want to make sure I restate this again. Over the last 2 decades, Gaza has received more per capita aid and development dollars than anywhere else in the world. And where has that gone? People are not stupid in Gaza. People see it. The squandering of our people's potential and resources. if you want to also take the route of talking about the Israeli component, I mean, it is no secret to anybody, and it's not just the leftist Israelis or the leftist Jews or whatever. It's a mainstream Israeli society talk about how Hamas was ultimately useful to some of the extreme political players in Israel who didn't want to see the rise of a Palestinian state, who wanted to point to Hamas and say, look, Palestinians are all extremists. They're all Hamas. They cannot be trusted to have the two-state solution. Their whole narrative is based upon the destruction of Israel. And so any way you and finally, if you put, and I'm again being overly like simplistic here just for the sake of time, if you think about the resistance narrative that Hamas has championed, this really is not new for the Palestinian context. I mean, we've been proxies, of course, for other people's political agendas going back to the 50s and 60s and the Soviets and the pan-Arabism and whatever. But the idea of armed resistance has failed the Palestinians so spectacularly. Started in the Great Arab Revolt, and then in the 30s, and in 1948, and not accepting the UN partition, the pan-Arabism and the Arab countries. I mean, we've been, and then you have the nationalism of the PLO when Arab nationalism was spreading. And then you have the Marxism and communism of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who were supported by the Soviets. These are the guys that hijacked the planes and did all the Carlos the Jackal and all that. Then you have Hamas's Islamism, and then it's supported by Qatar, and then the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then the Muslim Brotherhood. And so Hamas on its own, the resistance narrative, not only is it corrupt, has it been used to torture, kill Gazans, steal their resources, set us back, destroy our prospects for peace, and actually nation build, but it's actually part of a decades long degradation of the Palestinian project, national project for statehood, for dignity, for self-determination. Because the more we, quote unquote, resist in this manner, the more of our people are killed. Like I lost 34 of my immediate and extended family members in this war, and I lost both of my childhood homes, and we can talk about that later. And the more of our lands are taken, occupied, seized. And so any way you slice and dice Hamas, it has been a net disaster for the Palestinian people. And that has been so incredibly shocking and disappointing and frustrating to, I've been part of many Arab, Muslim, Palestinian-American, and just diaspora communities in the West, in Europe and elsewhere. And to see the challenges at best, sorry, on the spectrum rather. On one end of the spectrum, people being reluctant to criticizing Hamas because that somehow means I support the war in Gaza. I am pro-Israel, or I am a Zionist, or I am a this, or it's so simplistic that somehow critique of Hamas equals that, versus, on the other hand, I've actually seen, and this is what's so alarming and dangerous and horrible, since October 7th, people went from, I don't like Hamas, but I don't want to say anything publicly because that's treacherous, to people actually supporting Hamas, like actually endorsing Hamas. And I don't want to hear anything from anybody about this is a fringe position in our communities. This is not a fringe position. This is something we say in front of others just so that we make ourselves look less bad. Hamas support is a mainstream position in most or many, in large numbers of Arab, Palestinian, Muslim diaspora communities. And if somebody says, no, Ahmed, you're wrong, I challenge anybody. Go to a Muslim community center, go to a mosque. I've done it. I've gone into mosques and I've tried to speak with worshippers. after and during Friday prayers and try to have those nuanced conversations like you and I just did, like I just laid out the case, and see what happens. So that has been so harmful because as a Palestinian from Gaza, family still there, lots of family dead, lots of family dispersed now all over the world. This position of Hamas's resistance or we cannot say anything against Hamas, it doesn't represent me and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Palestinians who are fed up with Hamas.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. We really appreciate your honesty and frankness, and this is what this conversation is all about. Let's move the conversation a little bit to the realities facing Palestinians and the direction much of the Western pro-Palestinian movement has taken. You know, I live in Canada, so we have seen this live. In particular, we'd like to hear your perspective on how some forms of activism have become detached from the needs and aspirations of ordinary Palestinians and what genuine pro-Palestinian advocacy might look like.
Certainly. So I mean, the reality is grim. Like the on the ground, I mean, circumstances are horrendous. Beyond just and this is a this is a big just beyond just the humanitarian suffering. And my brother is in Gaza right now. He runs one of the larger humanitarian medical organizations, British medical organization, all their field work. The the water, the sanitation, the spreading of bugs and infestations and the rodents, the heat and during the summer, the cold during the winter, the being in tents, the lack of privacy, the skin diseases, the lack of access to education to most of the students. The students have lost 3 years of academic instructions and they're entering the fourth. The destruction of the infrastructure, the loss of homes. 70% of Gazans are displaced in tents or shacks. The other, 20, estimated 15 to 20% are doubled up and tripled up with people in apartment buildings. And so every conceivable level of misery you can imagine on a day-to-day basis um, are just truly. And yes, there's some aid that comes in and support and supplies, but that's sustenance level. That's just to sustain the population. That's not really. No one is thriving. No one is healing. No one is recovering. No one is moving forward. Um, a big part of that, yes, you can again talk about Israel and the Israeli policies and all the Israeli actions. And I do. And I sit with Israeli officials and or advocates or whatever, and we have those deep, frank conversations. But a big part of this is that Hamas ultimately does not want to relinquish the not just the control over Gaza in the form of governance, but the control of Gaza in the form of the massive terror infrastructure that exists there with the tunnels, with their weapons, that at this point they're not really a threat to Israel. Israel has a big buffer zone around Gaza. Israel has degraded a massive amount of the capabilities of most of the capabilities of Hamas. Hamas is mainly a menace right now to Palestinians. Hamas is mainly now holding 2 million Gazans hostages, and that's what it's really negotiating with. Not what Israel is going to, not that they're about to carry out another October 7th attack anytime soon. Hamas doesn't want to relinquish control. They don't want any level of disarmament. They were offered, some of their leaders, safe passageway out of Gaza and go to Iran, go to Algeria, go to wherever you want. And I've heard that from top Western officials that they were offered those exit strategies, and Israel wouldn't come after them, and they refused. And so the suffering in Gaza is in part because no Arab, no European, no international body, country, donor, no one is going to invest a penny in Gaza's reconstruction or future without Hamas exiting the scene. The days of Hamas, how many wars have we had in Gaza over the last 20 years? Multiple wars. And Gaza gets destroyed. The international community comes in with billions of dollars, and Gaza gets reconstructed. By the way, I argue that actually, in part, it created a perverse incentive structure for Hamas to continue its violent campaigns and terror and activities. So Hamas, instead of assuming the role of a government in Gaza that can take care of its people and provide for them, because they won the elections and then violently took over and they were under international sanctions, they didn't have the financial resources in the form of aid or international. So that gap of caring for the population in Gaza, uh, that was essentially in part with Hamas, in part due to, I think, the folly and the ignorance of the international community, especially the NGO industrial complex and the humanitarian industrial complex, of which I was part of one time, like my family have been part of one time and are. They came in and said, okay, well, we'll take care of the people of Gaza, UNRWA, the UN, all these big NGOs will pump in aid money. The Arabs and the Gulf will come in money. The Palestinian Authority gave a little bit of money to Gaza. The Qataris, with Netanyahu's support, gave money to Hamas. The Europeans gave money to Hamas. So basically, Hamas was able to kick back and say, oh, how wonderful. We can be a government in charge, but we don't really have to provide for our people. So why did I just spend a couple of minutes saying that? Because that's important to recognize all of the aforementioned. If you want to fundamentally change the trajectory of Gaza, if you want to free Gaza from this vicious cycle of war, reconstruction, lack of freedom, lack of progress, and we're just trapped in this little prison of our own making, the prison that has Hamas, international aid, the UN, the Europeans, the money, the this, the that. Meanwhile, there's no airport, no seaport, and this is why you see all the planes that I have here. 10 years ago, I tried to build a small airport in Gaza that was no Hamas control, IDF approved, etc. Right now, I'm trying to build an artificial peninsula made up of a lot of the rubble with an airfield and a small seaport on it to rejuvenate Gaza, because I've had meetings with major figures in the world, and we've all sort of agreed that Gaza doesn't just need to be reconstructed, it needs to be reimagined, reconstituted to the benefit of its people, to the benefit of the Palestinian dream and national project for a state, a nation that isn't just defined by opposition to Israel, but is defined by Palestinian values, Palestinian institutions, Palestinian unique cultural and economic attributes. So the pro-Palestine movement, everything I just said to you, and by the way, there's being pro-Palestine, which I am robustly pro-Palestine, and then there's being, quote, pro-Palestine. I call them the quote community. So the quote community, they don't like anything I just said, because they're like, oh, how dare you not blame everything on Israel? How dare you say the Palestinians are not perpetual victims? I mean, the Palestinians are victims, but like I said, they're also victims of Hamas and their own people and of the international community, and they're victims of their own bad decision making, and they're victims of the journalist, academic, activist industrial complex that refuses to assign any agency to them. Okay, October 7th was a choice. It was not a necessity. All of what Hamas has done is a choice. And instead, people use, post-colonialism and Edward Said and like all these academic theories to justify things moving forward. So if you want to build a true pro-Palestine, forget movement. I'm talking a framework at this point. I'm talking an outlook. It starts with thinking about what I just said, and you don't have to do your own research, do your own assessment, but come open-minded with the fact that even if Israel's Ariel Sharon or Benjamin Netanyahu, even if they set a trap for the Palestinians, just because somebody set a trap for you doesn't mean you have to fall into it and then be like, oh, well, they set a trap for me and they allowed Qatar to give me millions, billions of dollars. Or, oh, they pulled out. I thought the whole point, this is what's so incredible in the worst possible way about the pro-Palestine movement. They're obsessed with the end of the military occupation, and I always say the military occupation, because right now the Overton window has moved to now all of Israel is occupation, and there's really no conversation to be had. If you're just going to call for all of Israel as an occupation and you want to dismantle that, that's not a framework for solution. You just want to destroy Israel, and like, why would the Israelis, left wing or right wing, why would they engage with that? Why would they 7 or 9 million Israelis who this is their home, this is where they belong, they don't know anything else but Israel. So if you want to be pro-Palestine, like they keep saying, we want the end of the occupation. In theory, Israel ended a big part of the occupation of Gaza in 2005. Yes, it retained control over whatever, this or that, and the borders, but those are issues that could have been negotiated once progress happened. Instead, in like the first 10 days of the end of Israel's control of Gaza in 2005, Hamas moved in and took it over, and then less than 6 months later, Hamas won the elections. So, like, I'm sorry, like who's Israel gave a chance. So, like, in a sense, the perversion of the pro-Palestine movement is such that they would almost prefer that Israel continued its occupation in Gaza. So, my theory is that if Israel pulls out of the West Bank, they're still going to say Israel occupies the Palestinians. So, be pragmatic. Define your outcome, define your goals. Destroying Israel is not a goal. Dismantling, quote unquote, dismantling the Zionist entity, that's not a goal. That's rhetoric. That's hate. That's a recipe for pushing people away. Understand the structural problems in Gaza with Hamas and with the aid industrial complex that created the realities that led to October 7th. Understand the narrative, the need for a rejuvenated narrative and perspectives on Palestinian renewal instead of just perpetual resistance, something positive and inspirational that can allow us to rally Israelis on our side, and yes, Zionists on our side. This idea of throwing around Zionism as a slur and thinking that, we need to wait until all Jews stop being Zionists. So that's just a small part of what you really need to transform the pro-Palestine movement into a force for efficacy rather than a force for noise, division, and radicalization.
Thank you. Thank you, Ahmed. I understand why you call yourself both pro-Palestinian and pro-peace, because you have this bold vision for Gaza's future, one that prioritizes autonomy, dignity, and opportunity. But let's move the conversation now to the West, because there are Palestinians living in Gaza in the West Bank. However, after October 7, we see Palestinians living in the diaspora turn more vicious and hateful than we saw in any other Muslim country. Are they being influenced by other countries to take up the Palestinian cause only for political reasons?
So unfortunately, I've noticed a trend whereby a lot of Palestinians, they they basically get radicalized once they leave Gaza or the West Bank, or they leave the territories, or they leave the Holy Land. And what I have come to realize is the reason for that is simple, and it's tragic. There is no infrastructure for Palestinians here who want to be pragmatic, who want to be realistic, who want to engage, promote peace, who want to denounce Hamas, who want to be with a meaningful pathway forward, a promising pathway forward, there really is no path, there's no infrastructure, there's no organizations, there's no Muslim organizations or Arab organizations. Of course, not all Palestinians are Muslims, but I've even seen that with Christians. There's nothing that they can plug into that can bolster and further uplift those tendencies or provide the kind of education to teach engagement. How do you talk to mainstream Jews and mainstream Zionists? How do you engage members of Congress? How do you do advocacy that matters, activism that matters? Instead, and this is where, like, I often say I'm envious of the Jewish community because they have, at least here in the United States, a robust network of all of these different organizations, community organizations, the federations, the Jewish community centers, the JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Councils. And then you have the ADL and the AJC, the Anti-Defamation League, and the American Jewish Committee. And then you have on the political side, you have AIPAC on one side, and then you have J Street on the other, and then you have Israel Policy Forum, and then you have on the like global world Jewry, if you will, you have the American Zionist Organization, World Zionist Congress, etc. You have all of, and then on campus you have Hillel, you have Atid with Israel Policy Forum. And then, like the real leftists over here, they have Jewish Voice for Peace, which has a mind of its own. There is such a diverse infrastructure that if you come out of Israel, you're like, okay, I'm a left wing, I'm center left, I'm this, I'm that. You have options, if you will. Unfortunately, when it comes to the our side, the Palestinian side, there's nothing that really exists like that. In part also because we have enforced conformity, forced cohesion, and engineered compliance in our communities, particularly in the West, whereby you have to adhere, you have to fall in line, lest you be called a traitor, a sellout. I've had people that tell me, well, I speak out against Hamas. I started speaking out against Hamas, but my in-laws are crazy, or I couldn't get play dates for my children, or the halal market people would look at me weird, or the masjid mosque community were not very friendly towards me, or people were unfriending me, or people were saying this and that. So sadly, I've seen Gazans leave, and this is, for example, like I've had some European countries that have asked me to help them with, like you have Gazans who ask for asylum because they're afraid of Hamas. And then when October 7th happened, and they were part of the pro-Palestine protests in Europe, and Europe, I think, is actually worse than the United States and maybe worse than Canada. Then they become pro-resistance, pro-October 7th, radicalized. So I'm not stripping them of agency, but I'm simply saying that unfortunately, everywhere you go in our community, sadly, there's just the clamor and the herd and mob mentality are the dominant feature, and it pains me. Now, I will share privately, or privately, people reach out to me all the time and say how much they appreciate what I'm doing, that like, thank God someone else is saying what they know to be true, but they can't say so themselves. Or thank God someone else is saying that. Or thank God someone else is taking the heat for this. While I take that as a sure and clear sign that, of course, our community, like any other community, are not monolithic. We have a diverse array of people who are willing, and it's not who are willing to hear different perspectives. And it's not just about Hamas. You will meet many Palestinian Americans here who despise Hamas, but they still endorse perspectives and views that in actuality are Hamas adjacent. They don't have the word Hamas attached to it, but when you're talking about resistance, when you're talking about everything is Israel's fault, when you're refusing to look at Palestinian failures and do any kind of introspection, and so lastly, I will share that at this moment, like the constituency that I care the most about are people in Gaza. It is not Palestinian Americans. And actually, I'm going to reveal something to you, and this is something that I share, but like, I don't like the title Palestinian American. I call myself an American from Gaza. And that's not because I'm ashamed of other Palestinians here. But I didn't have the lived experience. I came here when I was like 15, and I didn't have the lived experience of Palestinian Americans. I Everybody was my community. I didn't just self-segregate in the Arab or Muslim or Palestinian American community. And so that is also part of how I was never really shackled with that enforced conformity, enforced cohesion. Is that even? I mean, yes, I'm an American. The host mother that I lived with, she was a white woman in the Bay Area, and through her, that was the bedrock of my integration with the wider American society, and that really allowed me to embrace the free exchange of the concept of the marketplace of ideas and the use of logical argumentation, the use of evidence to make your points. And yes, you can be motivated by emotions. We all are emotional beings. I'm a very emotional human being, but I'm not my persona, my existence, my positions, they're not defined by emotionality. So that's where I think, unfortunately, a lot of Palestinians really have a hard time breaking those shackles.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ahmed. In the interest of time, let me ask you a question about the rise of anti Semitism. Now, of course, there has been a rise across the globe, but especially in Canada and the USA, North America, there's been an appalling rise in anti Semitism after October 7th. So, you have already explained that you distinguish between legitimate advocacy and anti Semitism or legitimate criticism of Israel. But what impact does this anti Semitism have on prospects for dialogue, coexistence, and peace?
Certainly. Unfortunately, I mean, it, the lines between anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism nowadays regularly devolves into anti-Semitism. I used to, and I still, I think from a purely intellectual point of view, I think someone can make an ability. Sorry, someone has the ability. Let me restate this. I think from a purely intellectual point of view, someone can make an argument that being opposed to modern Zionism as a political movement is not inherently anti-Semitic. However, we have seen since October 7th the proliferation of these shallow proclamations that someone will say horrendous things, do horrendous things, and then they'll be like, oh, well, I'm not anti Semitic, I'm simply anti Zionist. So anti Zionism has become this cheap shield for a lot of people to proclaim or to deflect um, instances, I think, of real and actual anti Semitism. I think there have been the normalization of the idea that Jews control politics and the media and the this and the that and the this and the that, and therefore it is okay to engage in extreme rhetoric and language that are inherently hateful, inherently discriminatory, because, well, what else are we going to do? They control the media and this and that and access to information. And if you look at the reality, by the way, like there has been a democratization of access to media and information. I would argue, and I say this to Jewish leaders all the time, and they agree with me that spending millions of dollars in pro-Israel advocacy money, Jewish education, Holocaust education, combating anti-Semitism, you now have someone, a random relative, no one, on Twitter. They can say something really hateful that gets tens of millions of views like that in an instant. And that counteracts all of this proclaimed superpower that Jews have over the media and over the this. And like the change in the media landscape, the change in, look at the change in political discourse and how in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, elsewhere, like, I mean, let's just oversimplify. If Jews, quote unquote, really controlled everything, would we have high level UN and parliament and congressional members and candidates and members of parliament in Europe and all of these high officials throughout the world making these sometimes I think unhelpful statements, sometimes insane proclamations and statements that shield Hamas, that accuse Israel or the Jewish community of things that are just inaccurate. So I'm just saying that the underlying premise that underpins the whole theory of Jews have ultimate control is invalid. It is not accurate. There is an equal access to the marketplace of ideas. So that's number one. Number two, I have been trying to tell people and trying to showcase, to model that 100% we want to, and this is where I have critique of some of the kind of historic tendencies of some of the pro-Israel community, is that there were, I think, sometimes reflexive reactions to any critique of the Israeli government, an attempt to try to shut that down with accusations of anti-Semitism. I think that has happened. We can talk about the extent to which it happened, to the extent which it hasn't. But I'm forward looking. I'm saying moving forward, my interest is in showing that Israel, the Israeli government, Israel is like a state, not its existence, not its people, not its right to safety and security, but as a state is going to be made up of political actors and players like any other country that make horrible policies, good policies, controversial policies, and those are not untouchable. Those, I think, we have every right to critique them. But if your critique of Israeli policy is, I want to dismantle the Zionist entity, quote unquote, for the listeners, um, that's not, it's not like a critique of Israeli policy. Like that's really not, that's a call for the dismantlement of like a nation, of a state. If your critique is, I think there are criminal and I've said even fascist violent settlers in the West Bank that many in Israel dislike and despise, who inflict violence upon the Palestinian people, and therefore I call on the Israeli government and the military and the this and the that to take serious action. And I just 2 days ago, I shared my critique of the like serious critique of the Israeli National Security Minister Ben Gvir, who was like, all of Lebanon should burn, all of whatever. And by the way, other Israelis and pro-Israel activists were saying, you're disgusting. Like, this is not who we are. Like, so that's totally fair. We can talk policy, talk specifics. But when you generalize, when the attack against the synagogue in Michigan took place by a crazy psychotic individual who wanted to blow up that place because he lost family members in Lebanon, and you saw a congressional candidate that had a hard time speaking out against Hezbollah, or you saw elements of the pro-Palestine community saying, well, this is the consequence of Israel committing crimes and committing this, is you're going to have people reacting and retaliating. That is disgusting. That is anti-Semitic. That is double standard. That is normalizing violence against Jewish communities, because somehow what happened overseas, over there, 10,000 miles away, needs to come to our shores here, and we need to basically engage in acts of retribution. What happened in Colorado here? What happened at the Israeli embassy to the staff of the Israeli embassy here in Washington, D.C.? I live in Washington, D.C. And The amount of normalization of that attack. These two young, I knew them personally. These two young staffers, and I wasn't like best friends with them, but I knew them as human beings, and I'm like, imagine just because they happen to be posted at a diplomatic, these are career like staff for the foreign ministry, and you're going to hold them accountable for actions of the state of Israel or for so anti-Semitism, and don't get me started on college campuses. I have suffered from this personally because I go to college campuses often and I speak there. And I have gotten protested by the pro elements of the pro-Palestine folks. And I'm like, guys, let's have a conversation. Please come in. Like, let's talk. Like, let's talk policy. They'll come in the room. I will give them what are ultimately 70% positions that the pro, quote unquote, Palestine community agree with. Opposition to settlements, right to freedom. I'm horrified by what happened in Gaza. I think there have been war crimes and horrendous atrocities committed in Gaza. At the same time, I'm forward looking. I talk about Hamas. I talk about like my family would still be alive if Hamas kept its soldiers at home on October 7th. So even though I gave them like 70% common ground of yes, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah. Critiquing Hamas, calling for peace with Israel, calling for dialogue and engagement, not just with anti-Zionists, but with Zionists, with mainstream Israelis. That then has made me anathema. Then they'll chase me all the way to my car in the parking lot and say, you're a traitor, you're a Zionist, and I need police escort. And some of like this has happened on and on. Or they'll stand, the best of them was when a bunch of, I went to Michigan one time, and when a bunch of white kids were holding signs that said Ahmed traitor, and they had like dollar signs for me that Israel pays me off or bought me off, etc. And that's the degradation. I mean, so by the way, that in and of itself is deeply anti-Semitic. Even though it's anti-Palestinian, it's also anti-Semitic. Why? It's disgusting forms of racism because it says that any Palestinian who dares have a free thought must be, by definition, a traitor, a spy, sold out. That basically Palestinians are monolithic. These are the same liberal leftist lunatics that believe in, don't believe everybody's different. They'll celebrate someone's identity as the non-binary identities. They'll say that African Americans or Latinos have diverse identities, and some of them are liberal, some of them are conservative, some of them are this and that. But when it comes to the Palestinians, whether it be the pro-Palestine community or the white liberal leftist allies, quote unquote, they will tell you, no, if you're a Palestinian, you must believe singularly that you don't talk about Hamas, Israel bad, Zionism bad, and if you dare deviate from that, we're going to now worsen our racism and pivot to anti-Semitism, which is Jews buy everybody, Jews pay for everybody, there was a hit piece written against me one time that was like saying Israel is paying me, Ahmed, $30 million to promote genocide. And my Israeli friends, we all had a laugh, but my Israeli friends were saying, oh my God, Israel is like so cheap. They'll never pay you $30 million. Are you kidding me? But that's the depravity of modern day anti-Zionism, is it has long crossed the threshold into anti-Semitism. And yet we still have the Mehdi Hassans of the world and all the activists of the world saying, oh no, like this is a totally legitimate, position, and Israel is suppressing freedom of speech on college campuses. Meanwhile, college campuses have been taken over by these lunatics, but somehow Israel and the quote unquote Zionists are suppressing the freedom of speech.
Wow, I could listen to you all day long, Ahmad, but in the interest of time, I think we are going to have to just very quickly, I would like to ask you a last question, and that is about your prospect for peace. or lack of peace, if you were to explain to a young Israeli and a young Palestinian the possibility of peace, what would you say to them? And we're running out of time, so this needs to
Of
be
course,
quick and short.
I'll make it very quick. On the one hand, one-on-one, I've always believed that the individual is smart, the group is dumb. One-on-one, if left to their own devices, most Palestinians one-on-one would choose peace without community pressure, without the fear of retribution or violence perpetrated against them. So believe it or not, the default, and I say this knowing full well, like the challenges ahead, the default within many Palestinians is I can't quantify it, but I would say over 50%, the default is seeking peace, seeking coexistence, seeking economic opportunities to better their lives. The rest, I think a significant chunk with some work, some education, some de-radicalization, some improvement of opportunities, they'll get there. But I don't believe at the big picture, if we don't solve Gaza, there's no peace. If we don't solve Gaza, if Gaza doesn't become a role model for effective Palestinian self-governance, if we don't de-radicalize, if we don't rejuvenate and reinvigorate Gaza to show what the West Bank can and should look like under Palestinian leadership, there's no two-state solution. There is basically the management of the conflict, of the military occupation in the West Bank, or of the horror of Gaza's under Hamas. And so that's why all of my focus is on what can we do in Gaza, because Gaza was ground zero for not just October 7th, for the regional wars and disasters in Lebanon with the Islamic Republic of Iran. But I fully believe, and also it was ground zero in 2005 for with the withdrawal of Israeli sentiments. And I fully believe that Gaza can, and inshallah, will be ground zero for the beginning of the end of the conflict and for true peace between Israelis and Palestinians.
Thank you. Inshallah, yes, Ahmed. Thank you for leaving us on a high note of hope. And I will hand this back to Amanda now.
Thank you, Raheel and Ahmed, for such a thought-provoking conversation this evening. At a time when so many discussions are driven by slogans, polarization, and certainty, you've reminded us of the importance of nuance, evidence, and lived experience, and the importance of genuine dialogue. I am so grateful for your insights, your candor, and your commitment to advancing understanding and coexistence. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We'll see you next time.